The first time Mabel Ralston heard someone call her too much trouble, she was 17 years old and standing in the kitchen of a man who had promised her the world, and she had learned then, with a kind of bitter clarity that settled in her chest like river stone, that the world was something men promised freely and delivered rarely. Now she was 26, and she had heard it enough times that she had stopped counting. She had heard it from Thomas Greer, who rode away from her family's ranch outside of Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1878 with nothing but a tip of his hat and a dust cloud trailing behind him. She had heard it from Daniel Price, who had courted her for 2 months with flowers he picked along the creek before deciding that Mabel's opinions were better suited to silence, and since she refused to be silent, she was better suited to be left. She had heard it murmured at the general store and whispered over fence posts, passed between the women of Caldwell like a piece of gossip that never quite went stale. Too much trouble, Mabel Ralston. Too sharp-tongued. Too headstrong. Too particular about things a woman had no business being particular about. Too prone to riding out alone at hours that made people uncomfortable. Too willing to look a man in the eye when he spoke to her rather than casting her gaze politely downward. Too much of everything that did not fit neatly inside the quiet life a Kansas frontier woman was supposed to want. She was not sorry about any of it. That was the thing that the men who left never quite understood. She was never sorry. She was only tired. By the autumn of 1882, Mabel was running what remained of her father's cattle operation largely on her own. Her father, Harold Ralston, had passed in March of that year from a chest illness that had been coming for a long time, and that no amount of the town doctor's remedies had been able to slow. Her mother, Ruth, had passed 3 years before that, in the winter, quietly and without drama, which was very much in keeping with the kind of woman Ruth Ralston had been. Mabel had been left with 32 head of cattle, 2 horses, a small farmhouse that needed considerable work, and an account at the Caldwell Bank that was dwindling faster than the autumn leaves outside her window. She had one hired hand named Otis, a grizzled man of 50-something who chewed tobacco constantly and said very little, but who knew cattle the way most men knew their own hands, and who had been loyal to Harold Ralston for 15 years and transferred that loyalty to Mabel without complaint or fanfare. She had 2 neighbors who nodded when she passed, the Haskells to the north, who were polite but distant, and old widow Fern Calloway to the south, who was the only person in Caldwell who had never once suggested that Mabel's trouble was her own doing. It was Fern who first mentioned George Hawkins. Mabel had ridden over to Fern's place on a Tuesday in October, carrying a jar of apple preserves she had put up the week before, because Fern's hands had been hurting too badly for canning, and Mabel liked to bring things when she came. The 2 women sat on Fern's porch in the thin afternoon light, drinking coffee that was strong enough to tan leather, and Fern mentioned, in the offhand way she always mentioned things she actually considered important, that there was a man who had taken up the Garrity property on the east side of town. "Name's Hawkins," Fern said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "George Hawkins. Came from Texas, they say. Drove cattle up the Kishom Trail 3 seasons before that, then worked a spread down near San Antonio. Word is he's had enough of working other men's cattle and wants his own." Mabel looked out across the dry, golden stretch of Fern's yard. "Good for him," she said, and meant it without particular interest. "Word is also," Fern continued in that same careful tone, "that he is single, steady, and does not talk too much. Fern, I am simply relaying information. You are simply matchmaking." "I am simply relaying information," Fern repeated serenely and took a sip of her coffee. Mabel did not think about George Hawkins for the rest of that week. She thought about the cattle that needed moving before the weather turned hard. She thought about the north fence that Otis had told her was beginning to lean in a way that would mean real work before winter. She thought about the bank balance and whether she could make it through to spring without selling more of the herd than she wanted to sell. She thought about all the practical and pressing things that filled the space of her days and left very little room for anything as uncertain as curiosity about a man who had ridden in from Texas. She met him on a Friday. She had driven the wagon into Caldwell for supplies, which she did roughly every 2 weeks, timing it to avoid the weekend crowds when the cowboys from the surrounding spreads came in to spend their wages and their restraint simultaneously. The general store was run by a man named Gus Pelham, who was fair in his prices and entirely unfair in his tendency to tell Mabel what she ought to buy rather than simply filling her list. And she had been standing at the counter engaged in this familiar negotiation when the door opened, and a man walked in who was not from Caldwell. She knew he was not from Caldwell because Caldwell was not a large town, and she knew every man in it by face if not by name, and this face was not one she had seen before. He was tall, somewhere around 6 feet, with the lean build of a man who had spent years in the saddle rather than at a table. He had dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that carried 2 or 3 days of stubble, and his clothes were clean but well worn, the kind of worn that came from actual use rather than neglect. He held his hat in one hand as he stepped inside, which Mabel noticed because very few men bothered to take their hats off indoors anymore, and he looked at the store shelves with an expression of calm, methodical attention rather than the vague, wandering gaze of a man who had no particular purpose. He noticed her noticing him and gave a brief, polite nod that contained absolutely nothing presumptuous in it, which was also unusual, and then turned his attention to Gus Pelham. "I put in an order last week," he said. "Fencing posts and wire, George Hawkins." Gus brightened in the way he did when someone had paid in advance. "Mr. Hawkins, yes, sir. It's all in the back. I'll have my boy bring it around to your wagon." Mabel finished her business with Gus, loaded her supplies into her own wagon with the efficiency of long practice, and drove back to the ranch without giving George Hawkins another deliberate thought. But she found in the days that followed that he had a habit of occupying the corner of her mind the way a small stone occupies a boot, not painful exactly, but impossible to entirely ignore. She saw him again at church that Sunday, which she attended less out of fierce religious devotion, and more because it was the only occasion in Caldwell where everyone gathered in one place, and she could hear what was happening in the county without having to ask. He sat 3 rows ahead of her, and did not fidget or look around the way men often did when they found the sermon long, which she found herself noting against her will. After the service, on the steps outside, when the congregation broke into clusters of conversation, she watched him introduce himself to Reverend Case and then to the Haskell family, and he shook hands firmly and listened when people spoke, and Mabel's neighbor Haskell laughed at something he said, which Haskell almost never did. It was Fern who manufactured the actual introduction, because Fern, for all her gentle manner, had the determined patience of a woman who had lived long enough to know exactly when to apply pressure. She appeared at Mabel's elbow on the church steps and said, in a carrying voice, "Oh, Mr. Hawkins, have you met Mabel Ralston? She has the ranch just west of the old Garrity property. You two are practically neighbors." George Hawkins turned from the conversation he had been having with Reverend Case and looked at Mabel with a pair of brown eyes that were, she thought, the most direct and uncalculating eyes she had seen on a man in a very long time. He extended his hand, which she shook because she always shook hands regardless of what anyone thought about it. "Miss Ralston," he said. "Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Welcome to Caldwell." "Thank you." He glanced briefly at the town around them, the dusty main street with its saloon and its bank and its scattering of storefronts. "It seems like a decent place." "It has its qualities," Mabel said carefully, because she had enough honesty in her not to oversell it. He looked back at her and something in his expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile but in the neighborhood of one. "That's a fair answer," he said. Fern, who had accomplished her goal, drifted away to speak to someone else with a smoothness that Mabel privately admired. Mabel found herself standing in the autumn sunlight with a man she did not know, which was usually the part where she either said something that made men uncomfortable or they said something that made her impatient, and the conversation dissolved. "I heard you've been ranching your father's spread on your own," he said, not with the tone men usually used when they said such things, which was either pity or a kind of dubious surprise. He said it simply, as a statement of fact he was acknowledging. "For the most part," she said. "I have Otis, my hired hand, but yes, for the most part. That's hard work." "It is," she agreed. "I mean it as a compliment," he said, and looked at her steadily to make sure she received it that way. She studied him for a moment, the way she studied all new things, directly and without apology. "How much land did you take on the Garrity property?" 300 acres, about 40 head to start. "I'll build from there. The eastern pasture near Garrity's old place has a drainage problem after heavy rain," she said. "The ground stays wet longer than it looks. If you're planning to graze cattle through there in spring, you want to watch for foot rot." He regarded her with what appeared to be genuine attention. "Good to know. I hadn't had a chance to walk all of it yet. The well on the south side is reliable," she added. "The one on the north is not. Garrity had the same problem for 20 years and never fixed it. Is there more I should know about my own land that you'd like to tell me?" he asked, and there was a dry warmth in his voice that made the question something other than irritation. Mabel pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "Probably," she said, "but I've already given you more than the Welcome Committee usually does." He laughed at that, brief and genuine, and it was a sound she found she did not mind at all. She drove home afterward with the sun slanting gold and amber across the Kansas prairie, and she allowed herself, very carefully, to think that he seemed like a person who might be worth knowing, and she left it at that. The north fence did need work, as Otis had predicted, and it consumed the better part of 2 weeks. They replaced posts that had rotted and restrung wire in 3 sections, and by the time it was done, Mabel's hands were rougher than usual and her back had opinions about the whole enterprise. She was in the middle of heating water for a bath on a Thursday evening when she heard hooves in the yard and looked out to see a horse she did not recognize tied at her post. She opened the door to find George Hawkins standing on her porch with his hat in his hand, which she was beginning to think might simply be a habit of his rather than a special courtesy. "Mr. Hawkins," she said with honest surprise. "I'm sorry to come without notice," he said. "I rode past and saw your fence work. Looks solid." "Thank you. I wanted to also tell you that you were right about the north well. It ran dry on me day before yesterday. I've started digging a new one and wondered if you knew where the Garritys drew their water before they sank that useless thing." She thought about it. "There's a natural seep about 200 yards south-southeast of the old well. My father mentioned it once. The Garritys used it before they had a dug well. You might find better water if you go down in that area." He absorbed this with a nod. He did not pull out paper to write it down, but she had the sense he would remember it. "I appreciate it," he said. And then, because he was apparently a man who said what he meant without excessive decoration, "I also wanted to say that I've been hearing things in town about you." Mabel's chin came up slightly. Here it was, then. Here was the part where he had been informed by someone helpful about the nature of Mabel Ralston, and had come to deliver the assessment in person or to satisfy his curiosity about whether it was true. "Is that right?" she said, and her voice was perfectly level. "People seem to feel they have a lot to say about you," he said. He looked at her with that same direct, uncomplicated gaze. "I don't generally put much stock in what people feel they have to say about women who are minding their own business. I thought you should know that." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. "That's a novel position for a man in this county to hold," Mabel said at last. "I've been told I'm not very conventional," he replied without any apparent distress about it. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "I was about to make some." "I would," he said, "if it's not a trouble." "It is never a trouble," she said, with a precision that he might or might not have caught, and stepped back to let him in. He sat at her kitchen table with the ease of a man who did not make a great ceremony out of being somewhere. And she made coffee and set bread and the last of the apple butter on the table, because it was supper time and feeding a person was simply what you did, and they talked for 2 hours. They talked about cattle and land and water tables, and the coming winter, and the price of beef in the markets to the north, and the general unreliability of weather forecasters who had never actually ranched a day in their lives. They talked about Texas and about Kansas and about the differences between them. He told her about 3 seasons on the Kishom Trail, which he described as an education in both cattle and human nature, and she told him about the year her father had tried sheep and the spectacular disaster that had resulted, and he laughed again, that same genuine laugh, and she found that she liked producing it. When he rose to go, he thanked her for the coffee and for the information about the well, and at the door he put his hat on and looked at her in the lamplight that fell across the threshold. "Miss Ralston," he said, "I think you are probably the most sensible person I've met since I rode into this county. And I think," she said carefully, "that you might be the least foolish man I've met in a good while. Those are not quite the same thing, but they'll do for a start." He smiled at that, slow and certain, and tipped his hat and walked off into the dark toward his horse, and Mabel stood in her doorway watching the lantern of him diminish across the yard until the night had taken him, and she thought that this was either the beginning of something or it was nothing at all, and she found, with a kind of private surprise, that she genuinely wanted it to be the former. He found the seep where she said it would be. He dug a new well. By the 3rd week of October, the well was producing clean water, and he came by to tell her so. And this time, he brought a portion of smoked venison wrapped in cloth, because he had taken a deer the day before and had more than he could use, and Mabel accepted it without making it into a thing that required comment on either side. They sat on her porch in the cooling evening and talked until the stars came out, thick and white over the flat, dark Kansas prairie, and Mabel, who had not found many people worth talking to at length, found that she could have talked to him until the night ran out entirely. They fell into a kind of rhythm after that, which was not courting exactly, or not yet, because neither of them was the sort of person who moved without some certainty of footing. He rode by every week or so, sometimes with a practical reason and sometimes without one, and she did not pretend she was not glad to see him, and he did not pretend he had come for any reason other than wanting to. They helped each other with the kind of neighbor work that the frontier required. She sent Otis over for 2 days to help with his fence building, and he came himself to help when one of her cows was having a difficult labor, showing up in the cold dark of 3 in the morning because Otis had ridden to tell him it was going badly and he had come without being asked. The calf was born just before dawn, small and wet and stubbornly alive, and Mabel sat back on her heels in the lamplight of the barn and let out a long breath and looked up to find George watching her with an expression she could not entirely read. "You've done that before," he said. "Many times," she said. She stood and went to wash her hands at the pump, and he was there with the lantern to light the way because the yard was dark and uneven. She pumped water over her hands in the cold air, and the lantern made a warm circle around the two of them, and she thought that this was the kind of thing she had not had in a very long time, someone present in the practical hours of her life without agenda or comment. "I'm glad the calf made it," he said. "So am I," she said. She looked at him across the lantern light. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," he said, just that, as though there were no other option he had seriously considered. November arrived with the particular gray seriousness of Kansas in autumn, when the sky pressed down low and the wind came in off the plains with teeth in it. The town of Caldwell pulled inward, as it always did, and people spent more time indoors and less time in each other's business, which Mabel generally considered an improvement. She was mending tack in the barn one afternoon, the small coal stove in the corner doing what it could against the chill, when she heard a commotion from the direction of the road. She went to the barn door and looked out to see a wagon she did not recognize pulled up on the road near her gate, tipped at an angle that suggested a wheel had given way, and a woman standing beside it with two children clinging to her skirts and an expression of controlled desperation on her face. Mabel went out immediately, because there was no version of herself that could look at a woman standing in the cold beside a broken wagon and not go. The woman's name was Clara Marsh. She was perhaps 30 years old, with a face that had been pretty before it had been tired, and the two children were a boy of about 6 and a girl of perhaps 4, and they had been traveling from Wichita to a cousin's farm outside of Caldwell, and the wheel had simply come apart on the road. Mabel brought them inside and made them warm and fed the children cornbread and the last of the milk, and put Clara Marsh in the chair nearest the stove with a cup of coffee, and a clean silence while she sent Otis for a wheelwright. George arrived before the wheelwright did, having apparently seen the wagon on the road when he was coming past, and he assessed the situation, went and got the tools he needed, and had the wheel repaired well enough for Clara Marsh to complete her journey before the light went. Clara thanked them both with the profuse gratitude of a woman who had been worried and was now relieved, and she collected her children and drove on, and Mabel and George stood together in the cold yard watching the wagon go. "Good of you to stop her," he said. "Good of you to fix it," she said. "That's about 4 miles she still has to drive," he said, looking at the sky, which was going dark and carrying the metallic smell of possible snow. "She'll make it," Mabel said with a confidence she mostly felt. He stood beside her in the cold, and she was very aware of the few inches of air between them and the warmth that came off him, and the sound of his breathing, steady and even, and the way he looked at the road ahead with simple concern for a stranger's welfare. And she thought that this was what a decent person looked like when nobody was watching and there was nothing to gain, and she knew then that she was in considerable trouble of the very best kind. She found out in the slow accumulation of weeks who George Hawkins was. Not the facts of him, which she had mostly established. Born in 1851 in Missouri, moved to Texas with his family at 14, his father dead in a farming accident when he was 19, his mother remarried and settled in San Antonio, no siblings who had survived past childhood. Not the history of him, but the actual composition of him, which was different. He was a man who worked without complaint and without praise-seeking. He woke before the sun, and he went to bed when everything was done that needed doing, and he did not consider this remarkable because it was simply what a ranch required. He was not easy with words in the way that men who were charming were easy with words. He did not reach for them quickly or use them loosely, but when he said something he meant it. And when he said nothing, it was because he was thinking or because silence was the right answer and he knew the difference. He had opinions and expressed them without arrogance, and when she disagreed with him, which she did regularly and with her full capacity, he listened and sometimes changed his mind, and sometimes did not, but never suggested that her disagreeing was a problem. One evening in late November she told him directly, because she was not a woman who circled things, about Thomas Greer and Daniel Price, and the general history of men who had found her too much trouble and ridden away. She told it matter-of-factly, without self-pity or bitterness, because she had processed most of what she needed to process about it, and what remained was simply information about herself that seemed relevant for him to have if he was going to know her. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which she had found was rare. When she finished, there was a small quiet, and then he said, "Every one of those men left." "Yes," she agreed. He looked at her across the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the night quiet and thick outside the window. "I have never once in my life run from trouble," he said. "I have sat down with it. I have worked it through. That's the only way I know how to deal with anything that matters." He paused. "And I'll tell you plainly, Mabel, I think the men who called you trouble were using the wrong word. I think what they meant was that you required them to be better than they wanted to be, and they preferred the easier road." Mabel sat with this for a moment, because she was not a woman who received things quickly that deserved to be received slowly. You said my first name, she observed at last. I did, he agreed. He looked at her steadily. Is that all right? She thought about all the careful distances she had kept and all the good reasons she had for keeping them, and she looked at this man across her kitchen table who had never once tried to make her smaller or quieter or more convenient, and she said, Yes, George, that's all right. He reached across the table, unhurriedly, and set his hand over hers, and it was the most unassuming gesture she had ever received from a man and the most deliberate, and she turned her hand over and held his. And they sat like that in the warm lamplight with the Kansas wind outside, while the space between them resolved itself into something it had probably been becoming for weeks. He asked her to take a ride with him on a Sunday in December, not a practical ride with a purpose, just a ride, which was the clearest declaration of social intent available to two people in 1882 Kansas. She said yes, and she dressed in the good blue wool dress she had worn precisely 4 times since she made it because the occasions for good dresses were limited, and she pinned her dark hair up with more care than she usually took. And when he arrived at 9 in the morning with 2 horses and the morning sun sharp and clean after a frost, he looked at her with an expression that told her the effort had not been wasted. They rode east along the creek, where the cottonwoods had shed their leaves and stood white and skeletal against the pale blue December sky, and they talked and were quiet in equal measure, and at one point their horses were walking side by side so close that her knee nearly touched his, and she did not move away. They stopped at noon on a rise that looked south over the broad brown prairie and ate the lunch she had packed, sitting on a wool blanket on the hard cold ground. And he told her about the first time he had seen cattle moving on the open plain, 10,000 head altogether, and how it had seemed to him then like something elemental, like watching water move or wind work through grass. And she told him about the morning after her mother died, when she had gone out to the barn before anyone was awake and stood in the dark among the horses, because she had needed something alive around her that was not grief. And he listened to this without trying to fix it or redirect it, which was everything. On the way home, with the sun going down in copper sheets across the west, he said quietly, I want to be honest with you about something. I'd prefer that, she said, which was the truest thing she knew about herself. I came to this county with the intention of building a ranch and living alone, he said. I had made a kind of peace with that. I want you to know that, because I want you to understand that what I'm about to say is not something I say without having thought on it. She looked at him riding beside her in the fading light, this quiet, steady, honest man. I would like to court you properly, he said, with the intention of asking you to marry me if you find me worth the consideration. I don't want to circle around it or be coy about it. Those are my intentions, and you deserve to know them. The prairie spread around them in all directions, enormous and cold and beautiful, and the horses moved beneath them in the comfortable rhythm of animals that had covered a good distance and knew home was close. Those are considerable intentions, she said. They are, he agreed. And you've thought about the fact that I have opinions about most things and express them freely. Yes, and that I will not be managed or redirected. I wouldn't want to manage or redirect you. It would be like trying to change the direction of the wind, and the wind is useful where it's going. She laughed, surprised by it, the laugh escaping her before she could consider it. She rode in silence for a moment more, and then she said, George Hawkins, those are the most sensible and honest intentions anyone has ever expressed to me, and I will give them the consideration they deserve. That's all I'm asking for, he said. She gave them consideration. It did not take as long as she might have expected, because the truth was that she had been considering him since October, and she had arrived at her conclusions some time before they were spoken aloud. What she took a few days to examine was not the answer but the nature of it, turning it in her hands like something she wanted to be sure was solid before she trusted it. She rode to his ranch on a Wednesday morning, which was deliberate, because coming to him was important. She was not a woman who waited to be collected. His ranch was taking shape in the way that honest work produced. The barn was finished and tight. The fencing was done in the sections that needed it most. The house was small and spare but clean and solid, and smoke was coming from the chimney. He came out when he heard her horse and looked up at her with an expression of careful attention. She looked down at him from the saddle. "I've thought about it," she said. And he said, "And I think," she said with the deliberate precision of someone who had chosen every word, "that you are the first man I have met who did not run from trouble and did not ask me to be less than I am, and that is not a small thing, George. That is not a small thing at all." She paused. "Court me properly," she said, "and we'll see where it leads." He smiled at her, and it was the kind of smile that went all the way through a person, slow and certain and warm, and he reached up and offered his hand to help her down, and she took it. Caldwell noticed, because small towns always notice such things, and the reaction was mixed in the particular way of a community with long memories. Fern Calloway said nothing except that she was pleased and invited them both to supper, which was her highest expression of approval. The Haskells were cordially accepting. Mrs. Pelham at the general store made a comment to someone within Mabel's hearing that she hoped Mr. Hawkins knew what he was getting into, which was the kind of comment that was meant to land and did, though not in the way Mrs. Pelham intended, because what Mabel felt was not the old wound of it but a sharp, clear impatience with anyone who thought knowing what you were getting into was a deterrent rather than a point. George, when she told him about it that evening on her porch, was quiet for a moment and then said, "Anyone who thinks knowing what they're getting into is a reason to hesitate hasn't understood the value of what's on offer." "Mrs. Pelham would say the value is questionable," Mabel said dryly. "Mrs. Pelham," he said, with a patience that was not unkindness, "has not been paying attention." He courted her through December and into the new year of 1883, and it was courtship as Mabel had not experienced it before, because it contained very little performance. He did not bring flowers he could not have named or recite sentiments that came from somewhere other than himself. He brought practical things that he had noticed she needed a new oil lamp wick, because he had seen her squinting at the old one's inadequate light, a length of good rope, because he had seen her making do with one that was fraying, a book of livestock management that had been published in 1880, and that he thought she would find useful, and she did. And alongside the practical things, he brought himself, regularly and without drama, and sat at her kitchen table and rode the land with her and helped with what needed helping and talked and listened, and was simply present. It was on a January evening, with snow on the ground outside and the stove doing good work against the cold, that she said to him, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, "I want to tell you what I need." He looked at her. "All right." "I need a partner," she said. "Not someone who manages the ranch for me, not someone who makes decisions because they assume they should. A partner. Someone who discusses, who considers, who respects that I have spent years on this land and I know it and I have things to contribute that are worth hearing." "Yes," he said. "Is that what you're prepared to be?" He did not rush it. He turned the question over with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said. "That is what I intend to be, and I will tell you when I fall short of it because I probably will at some point without meaning to, but yes, that's what I want." She nodded slowly. "And I need honesty, always, even when it's inconvenient. That I can promise without reservation," he said. "Honesty is not something I've ever found difficult. It's always the deception that takes the effort. And I need you to understand," she said, quietly now, coming to the center of it, "that I have been left enough times that the leaving is something I think about, that I will probably always think about it. And I am not asking you to be responsible for someone else's history. I am only asking you to understand it." He looked at her across the warm kitchen, this woman who had been called difficult and inconvenient and too much of herself, and he said, "Mabel, I am not leaving. I want to be here on this land with you for the entirety of my life. That is not a thing I say easily or without understanding what it means. I say it because it is true." She held his gaze for a long moment, measuring not the words but the man behind them, and what she found there was bedrock. "All right," she said softly, and the relief of it moved through her like warm water. "All right, George." He came to her in February with a ring that had been his mother's, a simple band of gold with a small chip of garnet that caught the light, and he asked her properly, down on one knee at her kitchen table, which was where they always ended up because that table had become the place where they were most themselves. He asked her to marry him and to build something together on this Kansas prairie that would last longer than either of them, and she said yes before he had entirely finished the question. And then she was laughing, and he was standing, and she was in his arms in the warm kitchen with the snow outside, and the ring in his hand that he had not yet managed to put on her finger, and he was laughing too, and she thought that this was the sound she wanted to fill her house for the rest of her life. They were married in April, when the prairie was waking up green and tentative under the wide Kansas sky. Reverend Case performed the ceremony in the church, which was smaller than either of them needed or wanted, because it turned out that a good portion of Caldwell came to watch Mabel Ralston get married, drawn by the combination of curiosity and the kind of communal investment in a neighborhood story that was not entirely benign, but was, in this case, largely outweighed by genuine goodwill. Fern Calloway sat in the front pew and cried without apology and blew her nose into a large handkerchief. Otis stood in the back with his hat in his hand, and the expression of a man who was moved but would deny it if asked. The Haskells sat in the middle and smiled, and even Mrs. Pelham from the general store came, though she sat toward the rear with an expression that was, by the end of the ceremony, closer to softened than she had probably intended. Mabel wore the blue dress again, freshly pressed and with a new collar she had made, and she had put wildflowers in her hair, the first small ones of spring that she had found along the creek that morning. And George stood at the front of the church in his good coat and a clean white shirt, and looked at her walking toward him with an expression that required no interpretation. Reverend Case asked the vows, and they said them clearly and meant them completely. And when it was done, George kissed her in the way of a man who had been patient and was no longer required to be. And the small congregation made a sound of collective warmth that the church walls contained and amplified. They celebrated at Fern's house afterward because Fern had insisted on providing the wedding supper, and there was no arguing with Fern when she had decided something. And there was food enough for twice the crowd, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a second one. And in the spring evening, with the kitchen door open to the yard, Mabel danced with her husband in the kitchen of her oldest friend. And George, it turned out, was a competent dancer who held her firmly and moved with the unassuming confidence he brought to everything. "You didn't tell me you could dance," she said. "You didn't ask," he replied, turning her smoothly. "What else haven't I asked?" He considered this seriously for a moment, which made her laugh. "I'm fair at baking bread," he offered, "and I can read Spanish well enough to get by, and I once broke a horse in 7 hours that everyone said couldn't be broken." 7 hours, she said. "It was a very stubborn horse," he said. "I know the feeling," she said, and he laughed and pulled her closer, and they danced until the evening turned to night, and the fiddles played soft and slow, and everyone who was left was a little tired and a little happy, and the spring stars were out over Kansas in their thousands. They moved between the two ranches as the spring progressed, which was a practical decision that also took some working out, because combining two operations that had each been run independently required discussion and compromise, and the occasional honest disagreement. There were 3 evenings in May where they sat at the kitchen table with ledgers and land maps, and talked through the difficult questions of how to merge what they each had, and what to keep and what to let go. And there were moments in those conversations where they did not immediately agree, and they worked through it the way he had promised, and she had required talking it out, listening, arriving at something that was better than what either had separately proposed. They decided to run cattle primarily on the Hawkins ranch, which had better natural water access once the new well was producing fully, and to use Mabel's land for the expansion they intended over the coming years. Otis stayed on and proved to be worth twice what his wages cost in both labor and institutional knowledge of the land. By June, they had a herd of just over 70 head and a rhythm that fit them both, and the house on George's property had been expanded by the room he had been building since February, which was now a proper bedroom with a good window that looked east across the pasture and caught the morning light. It was that window that Mabel sat by in the early mornings, drinking the first coffee of the day while the land outside came alive in the light, and she thought about how a place could change its character entirely, not because the place had changed, but because what you carried into it was different. The same prairie that had felt in the hardest years, like a beautiful indifference, now felt like home in a way it had not before, and she knew it was because home was not the land or the house, but the combination of them plus the person you came back to. The summer of 1883 was hot and dry, which was not unusual, and they worked through it the way everyone on the plains worked through hard summers, steadily and without drama, adjusting what could be adjusted and enduring what could not. There was a drought scare in July that made Mabel nervous about the creek levels, but the rains came in August and the pressure eased. George spent 3 weeks in July trading cattle, driving a portion of the herd north to the railroad at Wichita, and Mabel ran both properties in his absence with Otis and her own 2 hands, and the confidence of a woman who had always known she was capable. And when he came back with the proceeds of the sale and the satisfied look of a man who had gotten a fair price, he found everything in order and told her so. "Of course it's in order," she said, because she was still Mabel, but she said it lightly, and he smiled and kissed her and said that he had thought about her every day he was gone, which was true and which she believed. By September she knew she was expecting a child. She told him on an evening when the air had turned cool, and they were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down, because she had always thought the porch was the right place for large news, with the open sky as witness. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and unguarded in a way that even the most intimate moments between them had not quite produced, as though this particular news had reached through everything and touched the deepest part of him. "Mabel," he said, and his voice was different, lower and more careful. "I know," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it and said nothing else for a while, and they sat together in the cooling autumn evening and watched the last of the sun leave the sky, and she felt the enormity of the thing they were building and was not afraid of it. She was not an easy pregnant woman in the sense that she did not stop working or slow herself significantly for some months, because the ranch did not pause for anything, and she did not see why she should be the exception. George worried and did not always hide it successfully, which she found both touching and occasionally exasperating. Fern came over more often that fall, under various pretexts, and Mabel understood that Fern was keeping watch in her quiet, competent way, and she accepted this because Fern had the experience of having borne 3 children of her own and the knowledge that came with it. The winter was cold, as Kansas winters reliably were, and they settled into the particular closeness of 2 people sharing a house through months of cold and dark, which revealed things about a person that fair weather could not. She discovered that he was an early riser by nature rather than discipline, and that he found the first dark hour of the morning peaceful rather than difficult, which matched her own. She discovered that he heated up a room with his presence in a way that was entirely physical, but also something else, something she did not have an exact word for in 1883 Kansas, but which was the thing stories had always been trying to name. He discovered that she was ferocious about certain things: the arrangement of the kitchen, the management of the account books, the treatment of the horses, and that she held her opinions on these matters with a firmness that his expressing disagreement would not dent, and that this was not stubbornness but conviction, and the difference was important. They argued in February about the price he intended to sell a portion of the cattle for in the spring, because Mabel had followed the market reports in the newspaper and thought he was setting the price too low, and she told him so clearly and with the specific numbers to back it. And he listened and pushed back, and she pushed back further, and they went back and forth with the kind of directness that required both of them to be fully present. And at the end of it he said, "You're right. I'll set it higher," with a plainness that had no wounded pride in it and no condescension, just the honest revision of a man who had heard a better argument and accepted it. She had not known, until she had him, how rare that was. Their son was born in March of 1884, on a cold night that turned to a beautiful clear morning, and he was born healthy and loud, and with a great deal of dark hair that Mabel's was clearly responsible for. The labor was hard and long, but she was strong, and Fern was there the entire time, and the doctor came from town in the small hours, and the child arrived with the dawn in the way of someone who had decided to make an entrance. George was waiting outside the bedroom door, which was where Fern had put him firmly at some point in the middle of the night, and when Fern came out and told him, and he came in, and saw Mabel propped against the pillows with their son in her arms, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both with an expression that made something tighten in Mabel's chest with a fullness that was almost pain. "He's good," Mabel said softly, because the baby was quiet now, looking at the morning light with the unfocused attention of the newborn. "He's perfectly good." "He is," George said, and his voice was rough in a way she recognized as the voice of a man who was holding something very large. He put one hand against the baby's head with a gentleness that seemed improbable in those large, work-calloused hands. "Perfectly good." They named him Harold, for Mabel's father, with James for a middle name, which was George's father's name, and the combination satisfied both of them. Harold James Hawkins was, from his first days, a child who expressed opinions about everything with great volume, which Mabel considered entirely appropriate given his parentage. The spring of 1884 was busy in the way that springs on a cattle ranch always were, complicated by the presence of a newborn, and Mabel managed the adjustment with the same approach she managed everything else, which was to figure out what was necessary and do it and stop worrying about whether it was being done the conventional way. George expanded his role in the daily ranch operations to cover what she could not manage in the months immediately following Harold's birth, without comment and without keeping score. And Otis, who had apparently reached his emotional limit on the question of the baby, arrived one morning with a wooden cradle he had made himself in his spare time, set it in the kitchen without a word, and went back to work. And that was the most tenderness Mabel had ever seen from Otis, and she did not remark on it to anyone because she respected him too much. By summer she was fully back in the operation of things, Harold strapped to her in a cloth carrier she had fashioned because she had things to do and he needed to be somewhere near her, and it was an arrangement that worked tolerably well for both of them. He was a cheerful baby, mostly, interested in the world around him in a bright-eyed way that made her think he had her sharpness and his father's steadiness, which seemed like a good combination. The ranch grew through 1884 and into 1885. They added to the herd and they hired a second hand, a young man named Will Chambers who was 20 years old and hardworking and shy, and who learned quickly under the combination of George's patient instruction and Mabel's high standards. They put up a new barn in the summer of 1885 with help from several of the neighboring ranchers in the tradition of the barn raising, which was a practical community institution, and George and Caldwell had developed a better relationship in the 2 years of his residency than most newcomers managed in 5, because he was reliable and fair, and because people who worked with him tended to trust him. Mabel's relationship with the town was more complex and more interesting, and not without its friction. She had become, over the course of the years since her marriage, a figure of somewhat reluctant community respect, reluctant on the town's part rather than on hers, because what had happened was that Mabel had simply continued to be herself, and had eventually outlasted the doubt. She served on the school board committee because the school needed more competent oversight than it was receiving, and she told the committee so when they asked if she would join, which was the kind of statement that could have been off-putting, but was delivered with enough matter-of-fact honesty that it was mostly just accurate. She helped organize the relief effort when the McKinley family lost their house to a fire in the spring of 1885, coordinating food and supplies with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had run a cattle operation through several hard years and knew what actually needing help felt like. And she wrote a letter to the county newspaper in the summer of 1885 about the condition of the road between Caldwell and the neighboring township, which had been in disrepair for 3 years and which affected commerce and travel alike. And the letter was direct and specific and cited facts, and the road got repaired by autumn. None of this transformed everyone's opinion of Mabel Ralston Hawkins, because some opinions were too settled to transform, and she had stopped requiring them to. What she had was what mattered: a husband who was her partner in every sense she had asked for, a son who was growing into a person of considerable character, a ranch that was becoming something real and lasting, and a life that was entirely, unapologetically her own. George told her one evening in the autumn of 1885 that he thought she was magnificent. She looked up from the ledger she was working on. "What brought that on?" "Nothing in particular," he said. "I just think it and I don't say it enough." She considered this. "You say it in the ways that count," she said. "I should say it in words too," he said. "You're magnificent, Mabel. You are the most remarkable person I know, and the fact that anyone ever called you trouble is the greatest testament to their own inadequacy that I can imagine." She set down her pen and looked at him across the kitchen table, where they had been sitting together for 3 years now, this table that had witnessed more of their life together than anywhere else in the house, and she felt the full weight of the gift it was, to be known completely and loved without reservation. "George Hawkins," she said, "you are the stubbornest, most patient, most honest man I have ever met, and I am very glad you sat down." He smiled at her, the slow, certain smile. "What do you mean, sat down?" "Instead of running," she said, "the way the others did, you sat down and stayed." "There was never any question of running," he said simply. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." Harold turned 2 in March of 1886, walking with the purposeful haste of a small person who had a great deal of urgent business, and running with the spectacular inefficiency of someone who had recently acquired legs and had not entirely come to terms with them. He had his mother's dark hair and her sharp, assessing brown eyes and his father's deliberate manner when he was thinking about something, a combination that Fern declared meant he was going to be either a lawyer or a preacher, and both George and Mabel said simultaneously that they hoped it was neither. In the spring of 1886, a man named Calhoun arrived in the county with money and intentions regarding a piece of land that bordered both the Hawkins ranch to the north and the Haskell farm to the east. He was from back east, Kansas City originally, and he had the kind of money that came from banking rather than land, and he wanted to run cattle on a scale that required considerably more water rights than his own land provided. The water rights in that part of the county were complex and had been negotiated over years among the neighboring ranchers, and Calhoun's arrival with a lawyer and a set of papers that claimed broader rights than anyone had known he possessed set off a conflict that ran through the spring and summer of 1886, with the slow, grinding intensity of a legal dispute in a county without a full-time judge. Mabel was the one who rode to Wichita to consult with an attorney, because she had researched what their own water rights documentation said and had identified 3 specific points where their title superseded Calhoun's claims, and she presented these to the attorney with the organized clarity of someone who had been keeping careful records for years. The attorney, a man named Forsyth who had the cautious manner of someone accustomed to clients who had not done their homework, was visibly surprised by the quality of her preparation and told her so, and she thanked him with the equanimity of a woman who was accustomed to people being surprised by her competence. The dispute was resolved by August through a combination of legal argument, a county mediation, and the combined weight of the neighboring ranchers who had organized themselves with Mabel and George as informal representatives. Calhoun did not get the water rights he had claimed, and he retreated to Kansas City with less grace than he had arrived with, and the county moved on. George told her after it was settled that watching her in the county mediation, presenting their case with the composed precision of someone who had never once doubted her own ground, had been one of the more extraordinary things he had witnessed in his life. "You sat there in front of those three mediators," he said, "and you were the calmest person in the room." "I had the best case," she said. "You did," he agreed, "but it's more than that." She looked at him. "I have been fighting for things all my life," she said quietly. "The difference now is that I have someone fighting with me." He put his hand on her face, large and careful, and she leaned into it. "You always will," he said. The year 1887 brought changes to the county that were part of the broader change coming to all of Kansas. The railroads were reaching further, the open range was giving way to fences and farms, and the wild emptiness that had defined the frontier was resolving itself, piece by piece, into something more settled. Mabel watched this with a complicated feeling, because she had come of age in the wildness of it, and part of her would always be of that territory. But she was also practical enough to understand that what was coming was not entirely bad, and that the question was not whether it happened, but how you positioned yourself within it. George was a better reader of market trends than most ranchers she knew, which she attributed to his years on the cattle drives when he had watched the whole chain of cattle commerce from grass to railroad car, and he began adapting their operation in 1887 toward the changes coming, diversifying somewhat from pure cattle into a combination that would be less vulnerable to the price swings that were starting to affect the market. They put in a significant kitchen garden that year, expanded beyond what they needed for the house, which gave them something to sell at the Caldwell market on Saturdays. They planted a small apple orchard on the south slope of Mabel's original property, because she had always wanted one and the soil there was right for it, and they both understood that the trees they planted would be producing well by the time Harold was old enough to eat the apples without assistance. It was while they were planting the first of the apple trees, in a warm April afternoon with Harold sitting in the dirt nearby, applying himself seriously to the task of filling his shoes with soil, that Mabel told George she was expecting again. He looked up from the hole he was digging, the afternoon light on his face, and his expression went through several things quickly before arriving at the same openness it had shown her the first time. "When?" he said. "October, I think," she said. He set the shovel aside and came to her and put his arms around her in the warm afternoon, and she put her face against his neck, and he held her quietly for a moment, the way he held things without excess, with complete attention. "Two," he said. "Two," she agreed against his shoulder. Harold looked up from his shoe-filling enterprise and observed his parents with the practical interest of a 2-year-old presented with something he did not yet have context for. "Papa," he said, which was still among the clearest words he had. "Yes," George said, releasing Mabel to crouch down to Harold's level. "We're going to have a new person in the house." Harold considered this with deep seriousness. "Dog," he said. Mabel laughed so hard she had to hold onto the apple tree. Their daughter was born in October of 1887, on an afternoon that was golden and calm, and entirely different in character from Harold's stormy March arrival. She was smaller than Harold had been and quieter in those first hours, regarding the world with a kind of measured attention that Mabel found extremely familiar. They named her Ruth, for Mabel's mother, with a leaner for a middle name, which had been George's mother's given name, and the naming felt like an honoring of the women who had come before them. Ruth Eleanor Hawkins grew into an expression of both her parents in different proportions from her brother. She had her father's brown eyes and his deliberate manner, and her mother's sharpness and her mother's particular way of looking at something, until she had understood it completely. And she was, from early on, a child who did not cry without reason, but who had very definite opinions about what constituted reason. Harold adored her with the wholehearted commitment of a 3-year-old who has been given something new and wonderful and has decided it belongs to him. He brought her small gifts, pebbles and leaves and once a live beetle, with the serious generosity of someone who did not understand that infants were not ready for beetles, and Mabel and George let him bring the pebbles and the leaves and redirected the beetle. The ranch in 1888 and 1889 was a place of considerable activity, and something that Mabel, in the private accounting of her own interior life, could only call joy. Not the uncomplicated joy of someone who had never known difficulty. She was too much herself for that, but the specific, earned joy of someone who had built a thing with their own hands and could look at it clearly and see that it was good. The cattle herd had grown to 130 head, which was a size they managed well with Otis and Will Chambers and the occasional seasonal help. The apple orchard was establishing itself, still young but growing with the patient intention of trees that have found the right soil. The 2 children were healthy and alive and interesting, which Mabel considered the highest praise she could give them. George was everything she had needed, and then some things she had not known to need until she had them, and she told him so, not often but at the moments it counted, because she was not a woman who said things without meaning them, but she was also not a woman who withheld things that were true. There was a night in the winter of 1889 when the children were both asleep, and the house was quiet, and she and George sat by the fire with the snow coming down thick outside the windows. He had been reading a farm journal and she had been working on the account books, and they had been in the same comfortable silence they could inhabit now like a room they knew well, when she looked up and found him looking at her, not with any particular urgency, but with that full, undemanding attention he had always given her. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He set the journal down. "I was thinking about the Sunday I met you," he said, "on the church steps. You were the most striking person I had ever seen in my life, and you told me my land had drainage problems." She smiled. "Your land did have drainage problems." "It did," he agreed. "And I thought that you were either the most useful person I would ever meet or the most dangerous, and I was right on both counts." She laughed. "Dangerous," she said. "I've been called worse." "Not by me," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "Not by you." The fire settled in the grate and the snow came down outside and the children slept in the other room and the world was very still. "George," she said. "Mabel, I want you to know that this is the life I would choose again," she said. "If I were standing at the beginning of it and I could see all of it, I would choose it. All of it." He held her gaze for a long moment with the steadiness that was his most fundamental quality. "So would I," he said, without hesitation. She closed the account book and went and sat beside him on the settle by the fire, and he put his arm around her and she settled against him, and they sat together while the snow came down and the fire burned, and the house held the warmth of everything they had built inside it. The year 1890 brought with it the beginning of one of the most difficult agricultural periods in Kansas history, as a drought began to tighten across the state that would worsen into 1891 and test everyone who had built their lives on the land. Mabel and George had been watching the signs of it since late in 1889, reading the skies and the creek levels with the experienced attention of people who had been paying close attention to this land for years, and they had made preparations that helped them weather what was coming better than many of their neighbors. They sold more of the herd than they had planned to, earlier than they had planned to, which was a difficult decision that felt like a retreat, but turned out to be wisdom. They conserved water with a strictness that required everyone on the ranch to be disciplined about it, which Otis and Will accepted without complaint, because they could read the sky as well as anyone. They drew on the apple orchard for trade in ways they had not anticipated needing to, and the small kitchen garden that had seemed like a pleasant addition in better years became a genuine resource. Other ranchers around them struggled more severely. The Haskells to the north of them lost a significant portion of their herd to the drought and had to make decisions about whether to stay. Mabel rode over to see them in March of 1890 and came back and told George that they needed to help if they could, and he agreed. And they helped where helping was possible without endangering their own operation, which required the careful judgment of people who had exactly enough and not more. There were nights in 1890 and 1891 when Mabel lay awake running numbers in her head, calculating the balance between what they had and what they owed and what they needed, and George lay awake doing the same in his own way, and they talked about it in the dark, quietly and honestly, which was the only way they knew how to talk about hard things. "We're going to be all right," he said one night in the winter of 1890. "Yes," she said. Not because she was certain, but because she believed it and the distinction mattered. "We have built something solid," he said. "Solid things last through the hard seasons." "Solid things still have hard seasons," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "But they come through them." She reached across in the dark and found his hand, and he held it, and they lay in the winter dark, and the wind moved over the prairie outside with a sound like something ancient. And Mabel thought about all the times she had lain in this house, first alone and then with this man, and how the same wind that had sounded different then. By 1892, the drought had begun to break in their part of Kansas, the rains returning with the slow, reliable intention of weather that has temporary conditions and permanent cycles. The recovery was not immediate recovery, never was, but it was real. And the cattle that remained were well, and the creek was rising, and the apple trees, now 5 years old, were beginning to produce in earnest. Harold was 8 years old in the spring of 1892, a child of considerable energy, and what his teacher, a young woman named Miss Harper who had come from Ohio to teach in the Caldwell school, described as exceptional stubbornness paired with genuine intelligence, which Mabel received with the expression of someone who was not remotely surprised. He helped on the ranch with the seriousness of a child who had grown up understanding that the ranch was the family, and what you did for the ranch you did for all of them. And he rode his own horse, a small brown mare named Button, with a natural ease that pleased George more than he always said, but that showed in his face when he watched the boy ride. Ruth was 4.5, a child of deep thought and brief words who observed everything and spoke only when she had decided the observation was worth sharing. She followed her father everywhere he went on the ranch, a small shadow with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady eyes, and George took her along on his morning rounds with the ease of a man who had found that a small child perched on the saddle in front of him was an addition to the day rather than an interruption of it. Mabel watched them from the porch on those mornings, her coffee in hand, and felt the fullness of it settle in her chest like light. Fern Calloway turned 70 in 1892, and her health, which had never been robust, became a more serious concern. Mabel rode to see her twice a week through that year and the following, and brought food and sat with her and talked in the way they had always talked, which was directly and with love, and without the softening that Fern had always found condescending. Fern talked about her own life, and the husband she had lost 20 years before, and the children who had grown and scattered, and she talked about Mabel with the proprietary pride of someone who had watched a person become themselves and considered it a privilege. "You found a good one," Fern said on a September afternoon in 1892, sitting in her old chair on her old porch with the afternoon sun on her face. "I did," Mabel agreed. "And you let yourself have him," Fern said. "That was the harder part." Mabel looked at her old friend. "It was," she said honestly, "for a while." "The trouble was never yours," Fern said. "I want you to know that I always knew that. From the first time I met you and you were 17 and Thomas Greer had just ridden off. You weren't too much trouble. You were exactly right. The world just took a while to produce a man who understood it." Mabel's eyes were warm with something she held back, because Fern did not like excessive displays. but she reached over and took the old woman's hand and held it, and Fern patted it with her knotted fingers, and that was enough. Fern passed away in the following February, in the winter of 1893, quietly in her sleep, which was the right way for Fern to go. Mabel sat at her kitchen table the morning after and cried, which she did not do often and which she did alone, because grief was something she preferred to process privately. George came in and found her and sat down across the table and did not say anything, but was present with the specific quality of presence that was his gift. And after a while she said that she was glad Fern had lived to see the children grow past infancy, and that she had known happiness in the last years of her life. And George said that was true, and they sat together until she was done. She put wildflowers on Fern's grave in the spring, the first ones of the year, the way she always had on Fern's porch, and she stood in the quiet of the cemetery and said what she needed to say to someone who had been, in a way that did not diminish her own husband or her own life, the first person who had ever looked at Mabel Ralston and seen exactly what was there without complaint or revision. The 90s moved through Kansas with the texture of a decade that was reshaping itself. The wildness that had defined the territory in the years of Mabel's youth was becoming something else, something more organized and less open, and the cattle drives that had been the defining commerce of the region were giving way to a different way of moving cattle, through railheads that were now close enough that the long drives were largely obsolete. This changed their operation in specific ways, and George adjusted for it with the characteristic steadiness he brought to change, seeing it as a condition to work with rather than a catastrophe to mourn. By 1895, the Hawkins Ranch was a thing of genuine permanence. The herd was healthy at 110 head, a number they had settled on as right for the land and the water and the labor available. The apple orchard was producing well enough that the Caldwell market had come to expect them every Saturday through the fall, and Mabel had begun selling preserves and dried apples in the winter months, which had turned from a practical supplement into a small but reliable income. The house had grown twice since George first built it, expanded room by room as the family needed it, and it sat in the Kansas landscape with the assurance of something that had been there long enough to belong. Harold was 11, a boy of strong opinions and considerable physical confidence, who had his mother's directness and his father's patience in roughly equal measure, a combination that made him effective and occasionally exhausting. He was serious about his schoolwork in the way that people who are genuinely curious about the world are serious about learning, not from discipline imposed from outside, but from the internal need to understand. He had decided that he wanted to understand cattle breeding specifically, and George had begun talking to him about it with the thoroughness of a man who took the question seriously. Ruth was 7, and she was, Mabel had concluded with a kind of delighted certainty, going to be formidable. She read everything she could find, including the farm journals and the county newspaper, and the agricultural bulletins that George received by mail, and she asked questions about what she read with the systematic persistence of someone who intended to actually know the answer. She had George's disposition and Mabel's intelligence, and a quality all her own that neither of them had produced but that had emerged from their combination, a kind of clear, precise observation of the world around her that made people feel, when she turned it on them, thoroughly seen. Mabel was 39 in the autumn of 1895, and George was 44, and they had been married 12 years, and the years had done what years do. They had settled into their faces and into their bodies, and into the way they moved through the world, and what the years had not done was take anything away from the fundamental thing between them, which had in fact deepened in the way that things deepen when they are genuine and tended to. She found him at the fence one evening in September, watching the herd settle for the night, the sky behind him going from orange to red to the deep violet that preceded dark. She came and stood beside him, and they watched the cattle together in the dimming light the way they had watched things together for 12 years now, "I was thinking today," she said, "about the first winter we were married." "Cold," he said. "Very cold," she agreed. "And we had that argument about the cattle price." "You were right," he said. "I was," she agreed. "But I was thinking about how I felt after that argument, how it felt to have you say I was right without it costing you anything. Without it being a thing you resented." He looked at her in the evening light. "Why would I resent you being right?" "Because most men would," she said simply. He considered this. "Most men are missing out," he said. She laughed, the laugh that 12 years had not changed, still sudden and genuine, and the sound he had decided very early was his favorite sound in the world. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean into him, without reservation, which had been the final frontier for Mabel Ralston, that particular leaning, the acceptance of being held without defensiveness. The cattle moved in the dusk, and the prairie went dark at the edges, and the first stars appeared, and they stood together at the fence of their ranch, their land, their life, and neither of them needed to say what they were feeling because the other one already knew. Harold married at 22 in 1904, a woman named Sarah from Wichita who had come to teach at the Caldwell school and who was, Mabel recognized with a private smile, not entirely unlike herself in the relevant qualities, direct and capable, and in no particular need of management. George made a toast at the wedding supper that made Harold's eyes bright and Sarah cry, which was the effect of a well-made toast, and Mabel sat beside him at the table and thought that whatever they had built had been worth every hard year of building it. Ruth, at 16 in 1903, was deep in her studies and showed every indication of wanting more education than the county school could provide, and Mabel and George talked seriously about what that might mean and how to provide it, because they had always known that what they were raising were people, not simply heirs to a ranch, and people had to be able to go where their nature led them. Ruth's nature was leading her toward learning with a clarity of direction that made the question of how to support it more urgent with each passing year. By 1905, Ruth had been accepted at a school in Wichita that offered education past the county level, and she went in the fall with a trunk of books and the composure of someone who had been preparing for this for years. Mabel rode with her to put her on the train and stood on the Caldwell platform in the October morning and watched the train take her second child toward her own life and felt the complicated fullness of loving someone enough to let them go fully. The ranch in the years after the children were grown was quieter, which was a different quality of life rather than a lesser one. George and Mabel had the rhythms of a couple who had inhabited the same life for decades, who had built the vocabulary of their shared existence so thoroughly that some things were understood without speaking, and the things that were spoken had the quality of being said by people who genuinely wanted to hear each other. They took a trip in 1906, which was the first time either of them had traveled purely for the purpose of going somewhere rather than to conduct business, driving by train to Kansas City, and then further, to see country they had not seen. George had always wanted to see the mountains and Mabel had never seen the ocean, and they did not get to the ocean on that trip, but they got to the mountains, the Rockies rising out of the plains like something from a different world, and Mabel stood at the foot of them and felt a wordlessness she rarely experienced, the silence that comes from being confronted with something genuinely vast. George stood beside her and she reached for his hand without looking and he gave it, and they stood in the shadow of the mountains together, and she thought that this was perhaps what life was, ultimately, not any particular moment but the accumulated weight of all the moments, and the person standing beside you in all of them. Harold and Sarah had their first child in 1906, a boy they named George Harold Hawkins, and Mabel held her grandson for the first time and felt the peculiar continuity of it, the sense of time moving through and not stopping. George held the baby with the same careful, wondering hands he had used with his own children, and the baby looked up at him with the same unfocused attention that all new persons brought to the world, and Mabel watched her husband become a grandfather with the same quiet completeness that he had become everything else. Ruth came home for the winter of 1907, and she had grown into someone extraordinary, which surprised no one who had known her as a child. She was studying, she told them, and had ideas about teaching in some capacity, and she was confident and clear-eyed and fully herself. And George looked at her across the supper table on her first evening home and said that she was the finest thing they had ever produced. And Ruth looked at her father with those steady eyes and said that she would not argue with the ranking. "You know," Mabel said to George that night in the dark of their bedroom with the winter outside and the house warm, "there were people in this county who thought I was too much trouble to be worth knowing." "I remember," he said. "I wonder what they'd say now." He was quiet for a moment. "I think they'd say you built something worth the trouble," he said, "and I'd say they still don't understand the word." She turned toward him in the dark and found his face with her hands, the familiar landscape of him, changed by time in the ways that time changes things and unchanged in the ways that matter. "I was never trouble," she said. "I was just a person who needed the right person to sit down with." "You were exactly right," he said. "The whole time, you were exactly right." She kissed him in the dark bedroom of the house they had built together on the Kansas prairie, in the winter of 1907, 25 years after she had first heard his name from Fern Calloway on a porch in October. And it was everything, the kiss of two people who had chosen each other fully and had made that choice good. The Hawkins Ranch stood on the Kansas prairie for decades, expanding and then settling into the particular dignity of something that has lasted long enough to be part of the landscape. George and Mabel grew old in the way that people who have worked hard all their lives and loved well grow old. Not quickly, not easily, but with a kind of grace that comes from having spent the years on something real. By 1915, they had 3 grandchildren through Harold and Sarah, and Ruth had returned to Caldwell at 30 years old to open a small school of her own, because Caldwell's school had grown and needed a teacher of her quality, and she had decided that what she wanted to teach was here rather than elsewhere. She was still unmarried and entirely content about it, which Mabel understood with a perfect comprehension that did not require explanation. George at 64 was still working the ranch, slower than he had been but steady, and Mabel at 60 was the kind of woman who had always been more force of nature than person, and who had not significantly altered this impression with age. She rode less and walked more, and the account books were now kept in Harold's hands under her supervision, which was an arrangement that suited everyone, including Harold, who had inherited his mother's precision with numbers, and was therefore very much aware of how closely the supervision was applied. They sat on the porch in the evenings the way they had always sat on porches, in the chairs that had been there for years, with the prairie stretching out before them, and the sky doing whatever the Kansas sky did in any given season, which was always something worth watching. One evening in the summer of 1916, with the light going golden over the grass and the sound of Harold's children somewhere in the yard being children with the full commitment of people who do not yet know that time is finite, George reached over and took Mabel's hand the way he had taken it on 100,000 evenings, and she held it the way she had held it on every one of them. "Mabel," he said. "George," she said. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I have never once regretted sitting down," he said. "Not for a single day." She looked at him in the summer light, this man she had known for 34 years, this man who had sat down with trouble and found it was not trouble at all but was, in fact, the most worthwhile thing he had ever come across. "I know," she said. "I have known that every day." "Good," he said. He squeezed her hand. "Good." The grandchildren's voices carried across the yard, bright and particular as birds, and the cattle moved in the far pasture with their slow, meditative purpose, and the apple trees on the south slope stood in the fullness of midsummer, heavy and generous. The trees they had planted in the first years of their life together, now old enough to have the authority of age, and the prairie went on in all directions under the enormous Kansas sky. and George and Mabel Hawkins sat on their porch and held each other's hands and watched the evening come in golden over everything they had built, and it was more than enough. It was the whole world.